come here. All right, welcome everyone to the very last session. Before I introduce our keynote, I'm just going to give you a couple of practical, or give you some practical information. We'll have a paper of approximately 50 minutes, and then we will have some time for questions afterwards. We might run a little bit over time, which I'm thinking will be absolutely fine because we're also interested in this right now. I know I am. However, those who are going to the dinner afterwards should aim to leave here 30 past at the latest in order to make the train from the station at 46 so that we can be at the restaurant. That includes you and probably myself. Well, all right, that being taken care of, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Nina Power, our keynote. She's a senior lecturer in philosophy at Roskilde University and the Royal College of Art. She wrote her PhD at Middlesex University on the topic of humanism and anti-humanism in post-war French philosophy. A topic she's also published widely on. She has also written a book which might be known to some of you. It's also been translated into Danish, called One-Dimensional Woman, or Eendimensionelle Kvinde. And she will be presenting on Marxist subjects, collective thought and action today. So, please welcome Nina Power.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Mika and the organisers for this invitation. Yeah, I know it's the end of the day, and I'm actually really tired as well because there's a big party in the street outside my hotel last night. So I'll try to, keep it perky. Anyway, so the title of my talk is Marxist Subjects, which is quite general, and I want to say that this is really an overview and a bit of a patchwork of various conceptions relating to how we might conceive of something like a collective subject in the current context. So I want to think about the relationship between the collective, different concepts of the collective and concepts of the individual within a kind of Marxist but also post-Marxist framework. So I'll be referencing various ideas of what this subject might be, whether we can continue to talk about a revolutionary subject or a subject of history in a kind of Lukácsian sense, or whether with Postoli and others that we might need to think of capital as the subject itself. And I'm not going to go into detail in those arguments. I suppose beyond this paper, I've been trying to think about those who are most subjected to violence of different kinds and what it might mean to begin from a subject thinking, the subject position of, let's say, a refugee held in limbo without any relation to a horizon of possibility in terms of relation to the future, to think about an image of humanity that is captured and the figure of the refugee. I'm also trying to think, as Mikhail mentioned, some earlier work I did was on the relationship between humanism and anti-humanism. Also trying to think about the concept of a kind of radical anti-racist humanism in Fanon, in the wake of practical and organisational groups and campaigns and actions such as Black Lives Matter, and Fanon's call for a new history of man, which is a kind of reciprocal, relationist humanism that would take into account the history of violent crimes, the history of the West, the history of capitalism, slavery and colonialism. And I suppose also in terms of the question of action today, collective thought and action today, thinking about no borders politics and kind of anti-immigration campaigns against kind of the capture of people without status, without papers. Also in the context of fascism, ethno-nationalism, and what we might see as a kind of curious internationalism of nationalists themselves. And I think there is this kind of ruling class solidarity that they have with one another, which seems to form a kind of internationalism, where national dictators are perfectly happy to coexist with one another at the same time as reproduce kind of nationalisms and ethno-nationalisms within their own particular countries. Obviously, these are huge questions. These are the questions of today, both in terms of political thought and political action. And I suppose I just want to pose some kind of questions about what it would mean to think about a collective subject. What kind of collective subject can we think in the wake of Marx and in the wake of particular interpretations and readings of Marx that would help us to fight against these things, fight against fascism, neo-fascism, ethno-nationalism, and what would it mean? What would it mean to think about those kind of collective subjects? So some of this is also in the light of work I've been doing on the concept of the public in relation to public order law in the UK context, whereby the state kind of invokes this spectre or this ghost of the public in order to punish people who have protested or who are rioting. And there's a sense in which, in the wake of privatisation and the total erosion of the welfare state, which came up today in the first paper, in terms of the kind of willful political destruction of the public sphere, public goods and social goods, is there any way of re-engaging with the term public as one possible option as for a name of the collective subject, which is also fraught with lots of problems? It's a bourgeois concept, as Habermas and others have traced. But I'm interested in what the public might mean kind of beyond a legal context, given that the state seems to have control over the definition of who or what is a collective, who or what is a citizen, who belongs where, and those kinds of things. And I wanted to also put it a little bit, again this is quite speculative, in the context of kind of regimes of power and regimes of violence. And I think I want to say that we don't move exactly from one fixed regime to another in a kind of Foucauldian sense. We don't, it's not true, for example, that we have moved from societies that govern strictly in a disciplinary way with visible and authoritarian uses of violence to societies of control with invisible forms of surveillance and self-monitoring. And I think the point of making this point is to say that these multiple systems could coexist. It's not that prisons disappear in the age of CCTV. If anything, they proliferate. And I think we need to think about the overlapping of these multiple legal and material systems. So we can have both prisons and public shaming, CCTV and health apps. And similarly, the individual, this kind of solitary, property-owning, stiff kind of male totem, neither born nor dependent nor in relation, which is, what Marx describes as this Robinsonade, this fantasy of the kind of self-producing man. And its neoliberal cousin, the permanently self-marketing subject, or the subject forced to self-market, the walking precarious CV, the debt node, male or female, I think can absolutely coexist with slower, more historical circuits of identity, so nationalism in particular. So these things are all, can coexist, which is why you can have neoliberalism and fascism together. I think although we live in an age wherein one can identify as many things on the basis of a kind of self-declaration, the limits to this operation as a political strategy become immediately apparent when they're attempted as a political tactic. One cannot identify out of being a refugee, for example, because so many people are lining up to say, no, of course you cannot be British, even when, for example, you have been granted, though in every few cases, asylum and citizenship. So huge blocks inhibit many from achieving the status of individual within particular geography. So the refugee will often be positioned as both kind of victim but also threat, but not as fully human. I think that's the kind of presentation of this figure. So, I mean, there's a recent kind of empirical example of, in Britain, there was a call from a Conservative MP to use dental x-rays to reveal the age of refugees coming to Britain in order to differentiate between those who were children and therefore were worthy and those who were not children. So there was this kind of idea that there's a kind of a sort of lying core, a lying kernel at the heart of claims to refugee status. And this kind of attempt at differentiation is really revealed, I think, very much in this kind of reductive biological idea that you can somehow divide humanity up into particular ways. So that's in the background as well. And I want to read a quote from Michel Foucault, who I both agree and disagree with on various points. And it's not really to make a critical comment on this, I just think it's an interesting quote. And this is a quote from the 1982-83 lectures, Government of Self and Others, lectures at the Collège de France, and he says, "What concerns philosophy is not politics. It is not even justice and injustice in the city, but justice and injustice inasmuch as they are committed by someone who is an acting subject, acting as a citizen or as a subject or possibly as a sovereign. Philosophy's question is not the question of politics, it is the question of the subject of politics." And I suppose what I want to pursue here in the first place is a kind of philosophical outline of the lineage of the concept of the subject. And then think about how that might tie into any discussion of what we might call the collective subject, what names we can use to describe this potential revolutionary or resisting subject. Okay, so what does it mean to think about philosophy as concerned with this question of the subject of politics? I think in many ways this history of the distortion of the term subject is the philosophical story that has shaped practically all discussions of post-Husserlian thought in particular. If Descartes is the progenitor of the modern subject, it is not, as Etienne Balabar points out, because we find in his work the category of the subject as an equivalent for an autonomous self-consciousness, as we might misleadingly think, but because there is a retroactive identification of the ego cogito with the material bearer of his thinking. This self-subject, in turn, becomes misleadingly the ideal figure upon which political thought turns in the contemporary context. So we kind of conflate this kind of image of the self with the image of the subject. And then think that this self-subject, this kind of bad reading of Descartes, is the subject of politics. And then in a sense, this kind of leads to a depoliticization of the term subject in a kind of modern, i.e. post-Cartesian philosophical formulation. As Ricoeur puts it with reference to Descartes, there is a kind of complicity and identification between the two notions of the subjectum as ground and the subjectum as I. And subject here, he's referring back to the kind of older Greek sense of subject, which is something that underlies, which again reappears when we think about the relationship between the subject and the sovereign, although the subject in that kind of relation is also subjected to, as in beneath, in a more kind of political sense, as well as a kind of ontological sense. So we get this kind of historical conceptual flip in the concept of the subject as being a kind of passive underlying substrate to a kind of active subject. And someone like Rousseau is absolutely pivotal here when he kind of flips, he kind of actually condenses, I suppose, the sovereign and the subject together. So instead of the relation of hierarchy, he says that the subject is sovereign. And then you start to have this image of a kind of active political subject, such that the subject becomes an active agent, which is very unlike its original meaning. And yet, if we conflate this active subject with an image of the individual, we lose the sense of the collective. And I suppose that's what I'm trying to reread back into definitions of the subject, is this collective dimension. The double career of the term subject also influences another strand of thinking, which is of more relevance to the conference. And this concerns the subject of the subject-predicate reversal as discussed by Feuerbach and the early Marx. Again, there's a kind of conflation of two meanings of the word, the grammatical and logical, and the philosophical, and specifically the speculative relationship between subject and object. So in a passage from Feuerbach's Introduction to the Essence of Christianity, he argues that what the subject is, its being, lies only in the predicate. The predicate is the truth of the subject is only the personified existing predicate. The distinction between subject and object corresponds to the distinction between existence and essence. The negation of the predicate is therefore the negation of the subject. What remains of the being of man if you take away its attributes? Even in the language of ordinary life, one speaks of the divine not in terms of its essence, but in terms of its attributes, providence, wisdom, omnipotence. So taking as his point of departure the idealism of speculative philosophy, Feuerbach proposes a method of salvaging man, i.e. actual men and women, empirical men and women, from the alienation of their capacities and powers that have been alienated in theology, politics and philosophy. It is Feuerbach's analysis of the grammatical sense of the term subject, the replacement of essence by attributes, that characterises his reversal of the idealist occlusion of man's capacities and powers. And we can see how Feuerbach provides one major element in the early Marx's own project of undoing the pretensions of idealism and replacing them with a properly active and sensuous conception of mankind. Okay, so this is Marx in 1845. The method of the reformative critique of speculative philosophy as such does not differ from that already used in the philosophy of religion. We need only turn the predicate into the subject, and thus the subject into object and principle, that is, only reverse speculative philosophy. Of course, this mere reversal, if it also takes place at the theoretical level, does not suffice to negate the implications of abstract idealism, as Marx himself will go on to point out in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And this is the brunt of Marx's argument, both in the thesis on Feuerbach and the German ideology. Marx's idea of the subject as sensible practice, which comprehends the subject as being both social and actively producing, rather than the passive opposite of the object, undermines the reversal of idealism by both realising it and transforming it. On the theoretical level, the transformation comes about by understanding this new subject in all its social, sensual, concrete, productive and economic relations. So thesis 1 of the thesis on Feuerbach reads as follows. The chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice not subjectively. Hence, in contradistinction to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. Feuerbach wants sensuous objects really distinct from the thought objects, but he does not conceive human activity itself as objective activity. So you get that kind of move, the further move, like the third move really, in Marx. So the subject's own objectifying activity, its sensible practice, is here also raised to the level of theoretical activity. The subject as revolutionary practice clearly involves recognising the active capacity in the historically subordinated political subject. While Marx's definition of the proletariat as substanceless subjectivity, what it recovers and reminds us, as many present-day thinkers do not, is it retains the Greek meaning of the term subject, to go back to this idea of hypergrammenon, the thing that underlies. Zizek makes the following observation with regard to the relationship between Marx, Hegel and the subject. This is Zizek. Marx conceives the proletarian revolution as a materialist version of the Hegelian reconciliation of subject and substance because it re-establishes the unity of the subject, labour force, with the objective conditions of the process of production, yet not under the hegemony of these objective conditions, where individuals figure as mere subordinated moments of their social totality, but with collective subjectivity as the mediating force of their unity. What I think Zizek's claim doesn't take into account, however, is the peculiarly empty element of Marx's definition of the proletariat as subject, taking it instead to be yet another reversal of the subject-predicate proposition, and thus open to criticism from a Hegelian standpoint. Against Zizek, though, Marx doesn't mean, I think, that the subject is substanceless in the same way that idealist notions of the self are substanceless, nor that the subject is foundationless per se. And I think this is, I'll come back to this kind of question about social ontology, really, and like the reality, I suppose, of the collective social individual. And I think maybe this goes back to the question that was raised in Cern's paper about abolition, and I think the relation between emptiness and abolition, and what it means to actually not abolish in the sense of destroy, but abolish in the sense of eliminate the conditions of possibility for things and people being nothing, meaning nothing. I'll try to explain this a little bit. So I think the proletariat in Marx's sense here is without or doesn't possess substance, i.e. doesn't possess property, it doesn't own the means of production. And obviously in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx will say that when the proletariat proclaims its dissolution of the existing world order, it is only declaring the secret of its own existence, for it is the actual dissolution of that order. So Marx does not simply reverse the Hegelian terms of the subject-substance opposition, but rather invokes the older ways of the idea of a political subject and extracts a power from a part of it, i.e. the proletariat, that is precisely based on its radical lack, the total loss of humanity. And I think I wanted to move then to just think a little bit about the way in which the subject re-emerges in certain readings of Marx or certain Marxist thinkers as a form of subject effect, as an effect of kind of legal structures, and as a result of kind of subjection. And this would, I guess, most famously be Althusser's claim that the category of the subject is constitutive of all ideology, and that we should really think of the subject as a kind of effect, a kind of subject effect of ideology, and that all ideology has the function of constituting concrete individuals as subjects. And again, I think there's a kind of problem here about assuming that the subject is tied not to kind of collective social idea, but as a kind of, that it is an individuating force. But that the law, in a sense, creates not only individuals, the individuals that are legal subjects and the individuals of bourgeois ideology, the famous example of interpellation of the policeman shouting, "Hey, you there," and you're turning around, that you are transformed into a subject by hailing, but that also there are kind of legal groups that are constructed as well. And I think we see that in the law, where the law actually has this kind of performative or practical contradiction in that it needs to name individual legal subjects in order to prosecute named individuals, but at the same time, particularly in riots and protest situations, it will also want to prosecute the group. And I think there's a way in which the law then also constructs its own collectives as bad collective subjects, and these are the subjects of protests, these are the subjects of riots, who are constructed and punished precisely in an amplified sense often, because of participation in a collective group action. So, for example, in the riots in England in 2011, somebody stole a bottle of water, an offence that otherwise would, maybe get you a slap on the wrist or at least a very minor fine, and was sent to prison for 6 months because it was an action that took place during a collective kind of insurrection or uprising. So I think there's something to be said here a little bit about the legal construction of the subject, which I'm not going to go into too much, but I want to say that Althusser, in a way, doesn't say enough about how the law constructs collective subjects, as well as sort of individually felt expressance effect, subject effects. And I think there are resources, perhaps, in the collective subject, kind of against the law. Like, you can play the law on its own terms because it needs to assume the bourgeois subject, and sometimes it tries to prosecute groups without naming individuals, and has to drop cases because, it can't do that on its own terms. So to get to the kind of main point about what I want to talk about in terms of how we might think about kind of collective subject, and again, this is a really, really complicated question to go back to the humanism, anti-humanism idea. How can we think about a kind of collective subject that actually manages also to differentiate not only between different kind of relations to economic power, but also preserves antagonism? I mean, what does it mean if we start talking about, collective humanity when actually we want to talk about the ruling class and everybody else? So there's a kind of big question there about how kind of contemporary Marxist or post-Marxist theories try to do this, and what happens to concepts of the mass, the class, the party even. So I want to talk a little bit about what Balabar says, what Balabar describes as an unsolved problem in Marx. And he describes it as an aborted dialectics of the proletariat as class and the proletariat as mass. And I think that kind of discussion of the mass subject, which also turns up in Raymond Williams and others, and the mass is this kind of passive object, usually portrayed as a passive object, in which everyone else is a part of the mass, but you yourself as an individual, but the mass is that which is, you know, I don't know, passively, I don't know, the passive receiver of the spectacle, usually, like the mass subject in that sense. So we have a kind of quality-quantity problem here in the relation between the proletariat as class and the proletariat as mass, which we can think about historically. And furthermore, as Balabar says, there is currently a huge gap between the advance of passive universalization and the regression or crisis of active universalization, at least in its traditional forms, by which he means revolution. And at the same time, there is a corresponding withering away of the public sphere under the triumphant impact of communication. So again, there's a kind of a question about whether any of these terms are salvageable from the way in which they have been transformed. So if this is a kind of context, slightly depressing context, what can philosophy say about the mass and the collective in recent times? So I'll start with Badiou, who raises an interesting point about the naming of collectives, how we give a name to groups, and the inherent difficulty. So Badiou says, the place of proper names in the political field today is a very important question, because this conception of masses, classes, proper names, which is also the conception of the relation between singularity and universality, singularity of proper name, and absolute universality of action, of the action of the masses, is a very strong one. But probably, Badiou says, it's saturated or finished. So my goal today, he says, is just to open the way for a non-expressive conception of political dialectics, for a conception of political dialectics without that sort of becoming proper name of the action of the masses. And in this new conception, revolutionary politics is not the expression of or concentration of social contradictions, it's a new way of thinking and doing collective actions. This is Badiou. I mean, there is something very vague about this idea of thinking and doing collective actions, but I think Badiou does identify a certain gap that's opened up within political discourse, which the state has filled in. The state has come to determine all of the names of these kind of collective groups and given their content its own sort of meaning, if you like. So that it's the state that determines who the collective or the mass or the public is. And when we're talking about the state, not just the state in the legal repressive form in terms of courts and prisons, but more broadly in I guess what Badiou would call capitalo-parliamentarianism, so the fusion of the state with capital, and all of the kind of subjects that are generated by that fusion. There are those who cannot be seen from the standpoint of the state, though, and Badiou would always make this point as well, those without papers, those who are not counted, who cannot be counted as citizens or subjects in a particular way, who are definitely not part of the public, invoked by the law, what I mentioned before, the way in which the public is used as a kind of proxy or ghost to punish actual people. And for example, in situations of immigration law, it used to be a public good that somebody who had ties to the community, who committed a minor offence, would be allowed to stay in Britain, and that was invoked in the name of the public good. But now the public good in immigration law is assumed to be deportation. So the law just changes its mind about what it needs the public to be and represent, basically. And we might think, yeah, of course it does. I mean, let's be cynical. Of course the law is going to say that the public agrees with it. The same would go for kind of manufactured public outrage. It's not really a public outcry in any sense. It's usually a media-generated spectacle. But I think it's kind of interesting that they still feel they need to invoke this kind of spectre of the collective, instead of simply saying, well, we can do this because we're the law and we're the state and we can do what we like. They still need this mediating figure. And I think Badiou goes on to say, when he's talking about the riots, it's really a question of who gets to identify what exists, which is a very philosophical way of putting it. But this is how the law operates as well. He says the law is always a decision about existence. And for example, riots are also a question of existence, and not really a question of interdiction, prohibition, and so on. It's a question that a certain part of the collective totality does not exist properly in the legal conception. The question of the law is finally not only a juridical and a classical question, but an ontological one. It's a question about existence. So if the law's identifications are an ontological question, then it is no surprise that a certain strain of thought today looks for breaks or gaps within the legal or ontological framework. So in Badiou and in his precursor in many ways, Sartre, they both identified politics as an escape from the social and from the logic of measurement and enumeration. So where Sartre's conception of the group or the group infusion in the Critique of Dialectical Reason involves a break with social ontology in the name of an emergent subjective force, not previously visible from the standpoint of the situation, Badiou's concept of the subject similarly undertakes to break with ontology, although he will couch the subject's emergence in the language of subtraction from the situation rather than an upsurge within it, but I think it's a kind of minor difference in a way. So other recent attempts, just to briefly summarise what I think is going on in some theories, other recent attempts to name this kind of extra-legal collective subject, which has a kind of revolutionary or at least resistant potential, include the idea of the multitude in the work of Negri, Hart and Virno, among others, and they owe much to feminist work on social reproduction and lots of feminist work on unpaid labour, and I think this is one of the big kind of difficulties or difficult questions about the relationship between how we think about those included in the labour force and those excluded from the labour force on a global scale, and how we can think about that form of dispossession that might also include being part of a paid labour force. What does it mean to draw the line not between those who are employed and those who are not, but rather those who are members of a kind of global sort of neo-proletariat, I suppose, and those who are exploiting everybody in some way or another. So for Virno, the distinguishing trait of political movement is the extremely tight entanglement between the always already, human nature, and the just now, what he describes as the biolinguistic capitalism, which has followed Fordism and Taylorism. And this is Virno's wager, that it is only now when the differential traits of the species, i.e. that which separate us from other animals, namely verbal thought, the trans-individual character of the mind, neoteny, the fact that human beings are strangely young mammals, we never grow as old as other mammals in certain ways, the lack of our specialised instincts. Virno and others describe this as the raw material of capitalist organisation, such that it's no longer a question of, I suppose, exploiting skills and production in the kind of older classical sense, but that our raw humanity as such is that which is being exploited. So in cognitive and knowledge capitalism, it is our capacity to speak, to communicate, to collectively operate in a network sense, or it's our emotions that are being directly exploited rather than what we can produce. And this is a kind of contentious question, of course, and it's very it'd be hard to make this claim globally, and they tend to talk about it in terms of tendency rather than as a kind of empirical claim. But this kind of direct exploitation of our humanity as such, then, can return us to the question of politics of human nature. So the problem of the natural or of nature emerges contingently, that is, at a certain historical moment, yet as if for the first time. So I think they're trying to escape, in a sense, a kind of philosophical anthropology or a re-emergence of a kind of idealist humanism or a claim about what humanity is like. So it's kind of historicising the emergence of this form of capitalism. Virno reminds us of Marx's claim from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, where he says it can be seen how the history of industry and the objective existence of industry as it has developed is the open book of the essential powers of man. Man's psychology is present in tangible form. The difficulty here for Virno is identifying the cracks in the edifice and perhaps the antagonism. What separates the exploitation of human capacities under biolinguistic capitalism, as he calls it, from the resistance to such forms of exploitation, And Hart and Negri's rather formalistic apparatus in empire involves a kind of flipping of the switch. If the multitude could appropriate or reappropriate their currently exploited cooperative potential, everything would be just as it is, yet at the same time completely transformed. And it's a kind of image of a sort of underlying communist potential, that being is in essence communist. It's just that the kind of the communism of capital, if you like, the capitalism is able to kind of mobilize these networks and this cooperation in such a way that it can generate surplus value. But if we can only just recognize that and pull back, the networks already exist, and you can see why they would make this kind of slightly optimistic claim in some ways. Similarly, in the work of Bifo on the terrain of semio-capital, he talks about signs and language. He says economic production is increasingly tightly interwoven with processes of linguistic exchange, provides yet another example of this linguistic multitude approach. Our attention may be bombarded with information, lies, distortions, manipulations, fantasies, unkeepable promises, and so on. But it is also fundamentally a capacity that contains the possibility for publicness, for communication without manipulation. He says the general intellect is the foundation of a social corporation broader than that corporation which is specifically related to labour. So again, they're trying to broaden out the kind of, more narrowly classical category about what it is that is being mined by capital. What does this mean? What is exploited in semio-capital is the capacity to produce signs, which is ultimately a shared capacity, putting to work that which is common, says Bifo, that is the intellect and language, renders the impersonal technical divisions of tasks fictitious. What is exploited is only one side or part of a greater whole, which can be seen as a kind of capacity or a potentiality. For Virno, again, the crucial political question is the following. Is it possible to split that which today is united, that is the intellect, the general intellect, and wage labour, and to unite that which is today divided, that is the intellect and political action? And there are echoes of this idea for the need for a move to link up the general intellect and political action. Also in Bifo's call for a collective body to fill out and substantiate the depressed and anxious social brain, where he talks about the fact that we're in a state of permanent electrocution, as he puts it, that we're living in kind of net time, which is 24/7. The human body is kind of incapable of actually living at the time of contemporary semio-capital, and as such the body becomes extremely depressed and separated, and there's a kind of re-emergence of the mind-body split in Bifo's description of what is happening today. And I think we also see this in Alan Badiou's repeated calls for the idea, capital I, in the wake of widespread riots and uprising in 2011. He says the rebirth of history must also be a rebirth of the idea. The sole idea capable of challenging the corrupt, lifeless version of democracy, which has become the banner of the legionnaires of capital, as well as the racial and national prophecies of a petty fascism, given its opportunity locally by the crisis, is the idea of communism, revisited and nourished by what the spirited diversity of these riots, however fragile, teaches us. And there's a kind of interesting question to be asked of Badiou, which is his real relation to Marxism, and Negri has accused him of a communism without Marxism, which I think is fair in some ways, and he tries to tie the idea of communism back to kind of Platonism, which is an interesting move, but one that doesn't necessarily give you that much empirical detail about the critique of political economy, what that might mean. So it's a kind of economist, an anti-analytical position in some ways, and I think he's much closer to Feuerbach and Sartre and a tradition of a kind of minimalist philosophical anthropology, actually, even though he claims also to be an anti-humanist. Anyway, there is a sense in which older models of resistance in the form of unions and the refusal of work have been fractured and reincorporated by capitalism in the form of the expansion of what work itself is, and I think this is where the kind of linguistic capitalist people are going. The multitude, and Virno, Hart, Negri and others, tries at least to capture a mass subjective potentiality that doesn't cleanly divide between those in paid work and those without, among other things. For Virno, the very resource being exploited in semio-capital or info work, the capacity to communicate as such, is also, he says, the place where resistance and a new model of democracy can emerge. as the public sphere in the form of the welfare state, civil discourse, collective space, is more or less completely eviscerated and replaced by privatisation, vested interests, overstimulation and securitisation, Virno sees hope for a non-state-run public sphere. The question of whether this is in any way Marxist is an open one, in the form of a collective linguistic and communicative capacity as such. In a way, then, there is a hidden democratic resource lying dormant in part used for negative ends that rests with the collective body, which is forced too often to see itself as a series of competed and self-interested atomic mini-bodies. We can see all too often and too easily how language, the material of semi-capital, can be made to proliferate dangerous stories, weapons of mass destruction, and to create infinite frames for the most deadly modes of action, the war on terror, the war on drugs. The tendency for semio-capital to demand the excessive proliferation of signs in the mode of advertising slogans and hollow appeals to drive or for construction of drives can create the feeling that even talking about semio-capital and immaterial labour is part of the production of semio-capital itself, or at least not antagonistic in the way it might be hoped. Okay, so let's move on to the very final part. So, nevertheless, this identification of what we could call collective alienation perhaps usefully returns us to an older and perhaps somewhat unfashionable way of understanding what we mean when we say social ontology. And to go back to where I was saying that Badiou and Sartre, in a way, break politics and the social apart. Because for them, the social is, or sociology, if you like, really, is just the kind of description of what exists, but it cannot explain or analyse eruptions in the social, such as political uprisings. But I think there is a kind of question, and it is a philosophical question as well as a political one, about what social ontology is, and actually the role it might play in thinking about construction or an image of a collective political subject. So I just want to briefly mention the work of Carol Gould, which is from 1978, and her book Marx's Social Ontology, where she looks at the Grundrisse, which she argues should be understood as Marx's most philosophical work. And then very briefly at Balabar's conception of the trans-individual as a way of just trying to think about possible ways of conceptualising collectives, or the relation between the individual and the collective, really. And I think we should note that we do not yet understand what it is to be an individual, just as we don't understand what it is to live collectively, and I think Marx makes this point very well. You know, we live in an age of absolutely imposed individualism and atomization and alienation, but we don't know what it might mean to be an individual if we had free time and nothing else. If communism is free time, we don't yet understand the relation between the social the individual in terms of capacity, what it is we might be capable of doing together, and also what we might be capable of achieving ourselves. So it's not that the individual under capitalism is in any way a kind of a solid creature, you would say. So in Gould's ontology of both real individuals and real relations, as she describes it, where relation and individual are to be understood as inseparable terms, she attempts to extract from Marx an implicit metaphysical theory of the nature of social reality, a social ontology that performs a synthesis of philosophy and social theory. So her thesis with regard to the role of the individual and the community aims to demonstrate that the limited ways we conceive of these entities in opposition to one another is a result of the specific ways these forms exist under capitalism, such that we need to think beyond their current meanings to ascertain and overcome the apparent dilemma of Marx's simultaneous presentation of the self-realisation of the free individual and the full realisation of the community. And this is also a historical claim. As Marx puts it in Grundrisse, the more deeply we go back into history, the more does the individual, and hence also the producing individual, appear as dependent as belonging to a greater whole. So it's kind of reimagining the relation between dependence and independence under what communism might be. So Gould's social ontology involves a strong interpretation of one of the terms in Marx's claim, the sixth thesis on Feuerbach, the idea that the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual, and in its reality is the ensemble of the social relations. Gould argues that we should understand by this that the individual is real and concrete, as are the relations. She states, what we need to show is that the concepts individual and relation are not separable concepts. This idea of the social individual is predicated on a two-sided conception of the social as well. namely the idea that all historical periods are social in different forms, but that the fully social individual has not yet emerged. She writes, the fully universal social individual may be seen as a teleological concept, like Aristotle's notion of actuality, namely it is the fully realised form of human development or its telos. Thus, even though the sociality appears in all stages of social development, these stages are also the stages of the development of sociality itself. But in order conceptually to determine what the social individual might be, Gould has to presuppose that it will emerge out of a situation of the alienation and objectification of human relations, even where this situation gives no indication of what the potentialities of what such a social individual might be. And I think this goes back to the Hart and Neckley and Virno point, where they're sort of, in a sense, desperately, and Bifo, looking for signs, amongst signs, looking for a kind of underlying, kind of pre-existing social individual, and kind of trying to find it whatever they can. And I think that sort of locating this is more tenuous and more antagonistic than perhaps all of these thinkers might imagine. If other collected terms such as the public have been so completely subsumed under legal and state forms and capitalist forms, it is hard to think of new words, which is Badiou's point, or new old words. Can we resurrect class? Can we resurrect proletariat? Can we resurrect universalism? Can we resurrect humanism? Can we resurrect the public? Or are they all kind of completely so overdetermined and subsumed? How are we going to kind of capture this lost ground, particularly if that ground itself has vanished? And I think, so people who are trying to think of new terms, I'll just finish with this. So, for example, Balabar's conception of the concept of the trans-individual as yet another attempt to think the political subject in terms of ontology. And I think, were we to have a long discussion about this, it might be interesting to contrast the transcendental claim that Sermon was making with the kind of the ontological claim, and whether we're talking about conditions with the possibility of the emergence of something, or whether this is a formal claim or a political claim, or what are we really describing here? So Balabar takes some of this from Simondon and thinking about kind of philosophy of biology. It seeks to describe an ontological conception that incorporates the reciprocity established between the individual and the collective, quote, in the moment of liberatory egalitarian insurrection. Balabar understands this concept as encapsulating a modern ontology of relations, which locates itself not beyond the opposition between individuals and their relations, like Gould, but between individualism and organicism. Balabar attempts to subtly alter the discussion of classes in order to avoid their capture by any form of static definition. He says, philosophizing for and against Marx means posing the question not of the end of the class struggle, but of its internal limits. The trans-individual can be seen as a way of coming to a certain kind of compromise with the discourse of alienation and ideology. Adoption of the term trans-individual then is an attempt to insert, he claims, a missing term into Marx's vocabulary to kind of construct this kind of philosophical, political, social, ontological concept and process, if you like, to characterise the constitutive relation which displaces the question of the human essence, to go back to Feuerbach and early Marx, while at the same time providing a formal answer to it. He says, we have in fact to think humanity as a trans-individual reality, and ultimately to think trans-individuality as such, not what is ideally in each individual as a form of substance, or what would serve from outside to classify that individual, but what exists between individuals by dint of their multiple interactions. And I think, to finish on a kind of more empirical point, the question of who gets to interact with who, I think is an eminently practical and activist question. And I think it's no accident that refugees are held in camps miles away from city centres often, unless you're in somewhere like Athens, where activists have liberated hotels in the centre and people are living now, though those are kind of completely contested sites and often shut down. And I think what I would like to just finish on as a highly, highly speculative and totally baseless suggestion would be for something like a form of trans-individual internationalism that would go beyond the divisions of state and capital and the way in which state and capital imposes certain kind of divisions. So to go beyond nationalism, beyond the subject, beyond the citizen, and beyond even the revolutionary subject in the classically Marxist sense, towards something like Fanon's New Humanism that captures the history of class antagonism as well as kind of geopolitical forms of violence. And that would be something like a way of thinking about the collective political subject today. But it doesn't have a very good name, apart from trans-individual internationalism. But so if there's a better name, we can think. All right, thank you.
In order to fully grasp what you've just been saying, is it possible to read that paper?
Yeah, sorry, it was too much.
What? Sorry?
It
wasn't too much. It was very interesting, but I think I would have to read it again in order to
yeah,
apprehend
I
it.
can send it to Mikhail or something if you want. Sorry, I probably read a bit fast as well.
No, it was very interesting. Very.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. Yeah. Like I say, but it's not really an argument because it's just like a speculative summary in a, so it doesn't have the kind of rigor of a proper paper.
I might add, we've also attempted to make a recording, depending on our technical skills, that might be available at some point. But I think you had a question. No?
Yeah. Yeah, just a very, just simple question, really. I really enjoyed your working through of all these different takes on how to conceptualize the political subject. The simple question is, you ended up saying something about Balibar and this trans-individuality.
Yeah.
Why is this more attractive than there's so many others that you've just presented to us? Because, certainly there are certain similarities between some of them. So what does Balibar offer us?
I'm not sort of totally, I did sort of end on this, let's have this trans-individual internationalism, but that wasn't in the paper. I suppose what I think I admire in Balibar's work in general, and also in the concept of the trans-individual, although I think it is open to a rigorous, more classical Marxist critique as well. But I think what he's trying to do is constantly and kind of dialectically think through the terms such as class and subject and citizen in their kind of historical, political and philosophical senses kind of all at once, and to preserve the various dimensions of those. So, when he says it's not about ending class struggle or ending the thought of class struggle, but of thinking its internal limits, it's a way of saying, well, this is a continuation of what Marx made. So it's to insert this missing term in Marx, rather than to say, well, Marx was too limited in thinking about, and I suppose one of my big issues with the Virno, Hart-Negri, so on, which I also find attractive as well. I can see why they're saying what they're saying, and I can see why they're thinking of all these certain tendencies in terms of cognitive, emotional, and knowledge economies, and so on, even though they're not representative of global labour, is that they kind of disavow, Virno less than Hart-Negri, but they disavow the philosophical anthropology that is implicit in the construction, the image of humanity in terms of these capacities. And I think it's the endless question that you have about how you read Marx, in terms of this battle between humanism and anti-humanism, and this question of kind of essence. And I suppose what Balibar does also give you is an image of process, that transindividuation is the process of the relation between individuals and their relations in a collective way. Such as it is a social ontology, like in movement, I suppose. But it's barely sketched here. It might just be that this is kind of just rhetorically clever. It displaces the question of the human essence while at the same time providing a formal answer to it. It's a bit neat, isn't it? It's like a solid common humanism, and I'm an anti-humanist here. But this there's something there. And I think that Carol Gould as well, you know, to actually say there's a social ontology in Marx, you know, which is a really unfashionable thing to say, you know, because of the way Marx gets read in terms of avoiding this question, you know, about not making these claims. You know, that he's overcome Feuerbach, he's overcome his early day, you know. And I think to reinsert that idea of the social ontology as a moving ontology and a historical social ontology, which is in Marx, you know, is also kind of useful. And yeah. But I read some of this to Balabar and he was like, oh, I don't really think that. Okay. Never mind.
I think there was a question from Nikolai.
Yeah, okay, so this may be very rude because I've just been told that I have to leave in 2 minutes. But I really like it. I have a question also pertaining to this trans individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I mean, subject in relation to what I think in a sense is my question. And this may also be from a sort of Althuserian perspective in a way. Because the way you presented Althusser is how he's always presented, but I think when you read through on the reproduction of capital, he actually defines interpolation on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
And one of them is definitely positive. So he says that he has been into little Louis, because he's referring to himself, and this is kind of sweet, but also kind of pathetic. But passages, he says little Louis, at first he's interpolated by Catholicism and the family and so on, but then at some point he's interpolated by the party, and becomes a party member. And this is so this is an interpolation as a subject, of course, but this is a subject of a mass movement in the form of the party, organized by the party. So what I wanted to ask is, so this kind of subject, the trans individual, in relation to what, I mean, or, you know, so, yeah, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose even in the positive interpolation in Althusser, I guess the issue for me would be that this is still thinking of the subject as effect. It's thinking of the subject as something which is produced, whether it's by repressive state apparatus or whether it's by another repressive state apparatus. But there is a kind of sense in which it doesn't. He doesn't think enough about the idea of subject as substratum. You know, subject in the older sense. He merely takes this kind of subject as production, as effect. You know, which I think is ultimately, it tends towards an individualist image of what a subject is, whether you're interpolated by a school or a church or a party or the law or the policeman. Which doesn't kind of also understand the antagonism or tension between an individual subject and a collective subject, but, you know, thinking about social ontology and relationality. So I think that's why. But it's not that I dislike Althusser's image of interpolation. I mean, and that image of the subject, you know, I think it's useful in some sense, in some context, but I think it's limited, particularly when thinking about the law and the construction of the public, and the way in which the law constructs group subjects, you know, negative collectives. You know, interpolation doesn't quite explain everything. So I guess that's why, I mean, I suppose again, Balabar is someone who is trying to, in a sense, in a post-Althusserian way and post-Foucauldian way, preserve some of that meaning of subject, you know, to be Althusserian still, but also to maybe tie it back. You know, when he writes about the history of the subject, you know, he's the one who says we misunderstand where it comes from. We think it comes from this reading of Descartes, you know, as the kind of active cogito, you know, but actually, I mean, in a way he says it's Kant that really invents subject, it's Kantian subject, and then the relationship between Kant and Rousseau becomes very interesting on the relation of passivity and activity. You know, like I say, it's Rousseau, you get the sovereign subject, which is both passive and active. You know, you have the pure fusion there of like the subject and the sovereign in Rousseau. But then we just kind of think of the subject as this active, you know, individual, you know, philosophizing, theorizing individual, which is the idealist problem. Again, do you know what I mean? I think it's just always trying to remember, almost like etymology, you know, why are we using this term, which on the one hand suggests passivity, but on the other we think of a revolutionary subject as pure activity, you know, because we oppose subject on the one hand to object, or we oppose subject to predicate, or subject to, you know, it depends what you pair it to, you know, whether it's the essence or the attributes, and, you know, we have to track all those different meanings. We can't just say there's one modern meaning and it's the active revolutionary subject, I think. that it's subject-effect in the Artisterian Foucauldian sense. And I can see why they're trying to avoid using subject in a particular way as well. But yeah. I think maybe it's relational